Welcome back, guys. Today we are going to be making an old-fashioned cornbread the modern way. So right here you see I have whole corn kernels and I also have whole rye grain. The recipe calls for 1 cup cornmeal and 1 cup flour. So I'm just going to make these together whenever I grind them. So we have the 1 cup corn and the 1 cup of rye, and I'm actually going to put this in my blender and it will make flour for me. I don't advise that you use a regular blender for this. Definitely use a blender made for grain grinding if you plan to do that. Otherwise you're going to want a either an electric mill or a hand grinder. So this is sped up, but as you can see, it's still pretty quick. And there we have our cornmeal and our flour together. I do not sift this. I use it as is. I have a little helper with me right here. She always wants to help. She's a really good helper too. And she likes to talk a lot. That's why I have to do the voiceover. So right here, we're going to take our fat of choice, and I'm using butter, obviously. You're going to take a 1/4 cup of this, and I'm going to put it in my pan, and instead of melting it on the stovetop, I'm going to melt it in the oven. It will grease my pan so that the cornbread doesn't stick, and it will melt it at the same time while my oven is preheating. Right here you see we have our flour that we put in the blender. And the silly thing about this recipe is whenever I first read it, it was in a 1920s cookbook. And right here you're supposed to use 2 teaspoons of baking powder. And for a couple of years I used 2 tablespoons of baking powder. And for whatever reason, one day I looked over the recipe and I was like, I've been making this wrong for years. I can't really tell a difference between the 2 teaspoons and the 2 tablespoons, but I still find it funny. And we're going to use 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda. So I know a lot of people like to sift their baking powder and baking soda. My sifter at the time was wet from washing it. So I just mix it up in my hand and it's just fine. Optional, you can use a tablespoon of sugar. I don't typically make my cornbread sweet. Oh yeah, we also use 1/2 teaspoon of salt as well. I usually don't make my cornbread sweet, but if you want it sweet, you can use sugar or maple syrup or honey. My children usually like to eat cornbread the next day as a cereal. I do cornbread milk and they'll put their own sweetener on it then. But this is just a 1 batch for dinner. I usually double the recipe. I didn't this day, so we didn't eat it for breakfast the next day. And I'm just going to mix my dry ingredients up here. That way I know there's no clumps in it. Right here, I know people are going to ask me why I'm cracking my eggs in a cup. And that is because we have fresh eggs. We have chickens running around our yard. And I have kids helping pick everything, whether it's garden eggs, if we have an animal in milk they want to help. So sometimes we come across an egg that's been out there a little too long and it's no good anymore. And sometimes, which this is very rare, it's only happened a couple times, we crack an egg not really realizing that it came off of a nest and we get a fertilized egg. So I just like to check by putting it in its own cup. Okay, so here the recipe actually calls for 1 1/3 cup of buttermilk. We typically don't buy milk from the store. We do here and there. But I use water because it's the liquid that I have on hand and it works just fine. So now we're going to use the wet ingredients to mix into the dry ingredients. I know a lot of people like to fold in their batters whenever they have a quick bread. I just stir it. I don't have time for that. So we're going to pour in our melted butter now. You can see our pan is greased And I'm just going to stir it in, and it will be ready to go back into the pan. And we're going to bake it for 25 to 30 minutes on 375 degrees. That's what we preheated our oven to. And then obviously at the end you'll see I test it with a toothpick to see if it's done, and it is. It typically always is at that time. And right here I'm just making sure that the sides get greased good. In this cookbook from the 1920s, all the recipes, when it calls for any oil, it just says fat, and I really like that because it's like it doesn't matter what you have on hand, just use it. If I had coconut oil, that's all I had, I would use this same recipe with coconut oil. But right here I have butter. I think I've used olive oil before. I don't buy like vegetable oil at the store, so this recipe I'm sure would work fine with that if that's all you had. But as you can see in the top, around the top, you can see that butter coming up the sides so it doesn't stick. That's why I like to melt it in there. And then we'll put it in the oven. All right, we're done. Didn't realize it at the time, but looks like it has a smiley face on it. Must be happy. All right, the cornbread's good. It is done. And on this day, I made a pot of purple whole peas for the kids for lunch. This is their lunch that day. And I'll get all that served up. And they'll have a warm bowl of purple whole peas with fresh cornbread. We also like to put butter on the cornbread too. Well, not all of us. Some of us like extra butter, some of us don't. And that's good if they want it, and that's good if they don't. But you'll see when I cut into the cornbread here in a second that while it is a little denser because it is freshly ground, it's not too dense. It's just perfect, as you can see right here. And I thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys have a great day. Please leave a comment with any questions that you have, and we'll talk to you later.